Gather round, children. I want to tell you a wonderful story. This story takes place a long time ago, millions of years ago, during the Stone Age, when our ancestors used only stone for tools and implements because they had not yet learned how to use metals. We lived then in small communities. We were hunter-gatherers. We got some of our food from gathering vegetable matter, and we got some of our food from hunting. Back in those days, sometimes we drew pictures of animals on the walls of caves. Sometimes we drew pictures or outlines of our hands on the walls of caves. We lived in harmony with nature. We understood animals and plants. We could use plants for healing. We were animists, and we practiced animism. Animism is the religious belief that people, places, and things all have spirits or souls, and we can pray to and communicate with the soul of any given thing. If we were hunting deer, after we killed the deer for dinner, we would thank the god of the deer or the soul of the deer that we killed. When we looked up at the sky and we thought about God, we thought of God as a woman. And we made ancient objects that are still in existence today, that have been found by archaeologists, that date to the Stone Age, that depict our ancient goddess ancestor whom we worshipped. And this goddess is often quite fat, and she has large breasts and a large belly and large hips, and she represents the quality of fertility, of giving birth and nurturing life. And we associate the earth, which is so abundant and which blesses us and protects us with food and shelter, with the goddess who is female. And in the same way that the goddess gives birth and nurtures her babies, we think of the planet Earth as a goddess who blesses us, gives birth to us, nurtures us, and protects us. And these are some more goddess figurines from the ancient Stone Age past. Back in the Stone Age, when we lived in these simple communities, everyone was equal. Males and females were equal to each other. Women could be the leaders of the tribe. This is because women were respected for their ability to give birth and to nurture life. But then something terrible happened. 4,000 years ago, in a very small country called Israel, a new religion arose. This religion was called Judaism, and the people who practice this religion are called Jewish. And in this religion, there is not a multitude of gods. There are not many gods. There is only one God. And this God has no name. And this God is not in the tree or in the fish or in the animal. This God created the world and created nature, but lives outside of nature. And this one God is often thought of as being male, although This God truly has no gender. Now, Jews have only ever been less than 1% of the world's population. There's approximately 7 billion people on planet Earth today, and I think there's fewer than 10 million Jews on the entire planet. So the influence of the Jewish religion was not very strong. Judaism existed for almost 2,000 years without having much impact on the rest of the world. But then, 2,000 years ago, there was a Jewish man born in Bethlehem in Israel, and this Jewish man was named Jesus, and Jesus was the start of an entirely new religion called Christianity. And Christianity became very popular, and it soon became the most numerous religion on the face of the earth. And through Christianity, the Jewish idea of one transcendent creator God, who is often thought of as male, spread throughout the entire world. This contributed to disenchantment. Disenchantment, because before, under animism, we thought that the world was imbued with spirits. There were spirits and souls and gods and goddesses everywhere, in the tree, in the creatures, in the weather, in the sky, in the sun, in the stars, in the moon. Diana was the goddess of the moon for the ancient Romans. Apollo was the god of the sun. But as Christianity spread, all these individual gods disappeared. The world became disenchanted. We no longer look at a tree and think, oh, the tree has a spirit or a soul. We just think it's a tree. We no longer thank the deer after we kill the deer for dinner. The people who believed in the old ways of paganism and animism retreated. They retreated to the forest, and they kept our ancient Stone Age religion alive. And they remembered throughout all the centuries the magic of the herbs and the sun and the moon and the stars. Slowly but surely, Christianity gained power, and Christianity used its power to oppress the women who survived from the ancient times with our pagan ancestors' knowledge about nature. And evil Catholic priests took these wise women from the past with all their knowledge of nature and our ancient ancestors' goddess religion and burned them as witches. And the witch trials were all about the Catholic Church destroying the old pagan religion in the Middle Ages. So during the Middle Ages, that is the years 500 to 1500, the Catholic Church, which hates women, murdered 9 million witches. These witches were really wise women, holdovers from the early days of goddess worship, who healed with herbs. The church didn't want to compete with them, so the church murdered them. And you can learn about this history by watching the documentary called The Burning Times. And you can also go to the Burning Times website. And you can also read books like Witches, Midwives, and Nurses. And there's only one small problem with this wonderful story that I just told you. None of it is true. Most scholars reject the goddess theory. We don't know if Stone Age figurines were goddesses or toys or pornography or amulets or fertility magic or what they were. Ancient people engaged in warfare all the time. They were not living in peace and harmony, and we have archaeological evidence of this. Early humans did not live in harmony with nature. Early humans drastically altered their environments. Humans may have wiped out the megafauna. Human burning increased the spread of deserts. Women are treated very badly in Stone Age societies. Jewish women hold a relatively high position, and they held a relatively high position in the ancient world. Societies where goddesses are worshipped are not better for women. Women were among the most enthusiastic early adopters of Christianity. The witch craze did not occur in the Middle Ages. They did not occur between the years 500 and 1500. The witch craze occurred in the early modern period, that is between approximately 1500 and 1700. The Catholic Church had existed for over 1,000 years without a witch craze. Before 1400, it was rare for anyone to be persecuted for witchcraft. And in fact, medieval church documents deny the existence of witches. In areas where the Catholic Church dominated, like Poland, there were relatively few witch trials, at least during the witch craze in the rest of Europe. The church didn't burn people, the civil authorities burned people. A Catholic priest, Friedrich Spee, was one of the first people in history to take a strong stand against the use of torture, and another Catholic priest, Alonso de Salazar Frias, used the Spanish Inquisition to resist and even to end witch trials in Spain. In many areas, the victims were not female. In Iceland, 92% of those accused of witchcraft were men, and there were other areas where men predominated in those accused of witchcraft. And this number of 9 million women, that's completely ridiculous. It's not true. The actual figure is closer to 45,000 over the course of 200 years. So let's look at some of these claims that pagans make about the witch craze, and we'll go one by one. Was Christianity a bunch of men imposing Christianity on women? In fact, no. Women were among the most enthusiastic early adopters of Christianity. And you have here a scholarly article by Rodney Stark, who says that Christianity was friendly to and supportive of women, that women had been pagan. They didn't like being pagan. Paganism did not meet their needs, and so they converted to Christianity. And in fact, you have a quote there from a Greek philosopher named Celsus, who lived at the time that Christianity was on the rise. And Celsus did not like Christianity, and he was a pagan. And he said only stupid people become Christians, like children and slaves and women. And here are some really cool animals that existed at the same time as human beings, and they're called the megafauna. Megafauna meaning big animals. And these animals were wiped out all over the world except for sub-Saharan Africa. You know that Africa still has elephants and giant herbivores like wildebeest and lions and all these other really big animals. Well, guess what? These animals used to live in North America. Who killed them all off? Stone Age humans. So this idea that Stone Age humans were living in harmony with nature is total crap. And here's a recreation of humans killing off the megafauna. And here's a scholarly article on how the megafauna were wiped out by humans, not climate change. And you know, in the same way that humans didn't really much like nature, nature doesn't really much like humans. If you've ever lived in a primitive setting, as I have lived, I mean, I've lived in Africa, I lived in Asia, I lived, you know, beyond, in places where there were no radio, no TV, no electricity, no running water, no doctors, no telephone, no telegraph. I almost died twice. You walk out your door and you could be stung by a tsetse fly or a bot fly or a black fly, and you can get river blindness, you can get filariasis, you can get one of my students in Nepal, God bless this child whom I loved, he died of a stomach ache. You know, he was in my class on Friday, and over the weekend he got dysentery, which is like constant pooping, and he died of dehydration, and he was not in my class on Monday. So this whole idea that, you know, there was this big love relationship between people and nature is just not true. And this happened a few years ago in New Jersey. A student from Rutgers University went hiking in West Milford, and he actually shot this photograph of a bear. And you know what happened after he shot this photograph of a bear? The bear killed him. So, you know, please don't tell me that there's harmony between humans and nature. And there's no harmony between humans and other humans, including in the Stone Age. There was a massacre discovered. Archaeologists discovered the remains of a massacre that occurred on Lake Turkana in Kenya during the Stone Age. You know, thousands of years ago, this is 10,000 years ago, humans were making war on other humans. So this fantasy that in the distant past we were all nice people and we were nice to each other and we lived in peace, this is nonsense. During this massacre, apparently a woman who was pregnant, possibly 9 months pregnant, was tied up and bashed in the head. That's not harmony. And here's a Wikipedia page on Stone Age warfare. And here's some statistics. And the point of these statistics is that in the ancient past, we were killing each other left, right, and center. There's no peaceful ancient human past. Here's a photograph of the Aborigines, Stone Age people living in Australia. When Europeans first arrived, there were 150 Aboriginal men for every 100 Aboriginal women. One more time, 150 Aboriginal men for every 100 Aboriginal women. Why? Because they practiced female infanticide. They killed their little female babies. And they also made it a lot harder for females to survive to adulthood. So this argument that Stone Age societies were really good for women, not true. Another picture of Aborigines. And this beautiful young lady is a Yanomami living in South America, also a Stone Age tribe. And here's a Yanomami settlement in South America. And here's the text from Wikipedia describing life for a Yanomami female. As soon as she starts menstruating, first of all, she's deeply shamed for menstruating. She has to squat over a hole in the ground because, of course, they don't have any sanitary equipment for her. And she has to be fed with a stick because she's considered to be so impure that nobody wants to have contact with her. And then she's given away to some man. Like, she doesn't get to fall in love and pick her own husband. No, she's now somebody's, quote, wife. And what does being a wife entail? She gets beat up a lot because that's how the man establishes his dominance, by beating his wife. And also another method for establishing dominance is burning his wife. He'll heat up a stick and he'll burn her so that there's a burn scar on her skin, and that shows how manly he is. And if she misbehaves or if she wanders away from the village, she's gang raped. So this idea that Stone Age societies are places where women are treated with respect and men and women are equal, it has not proven to be true. How about the idea that if a society does not worship a male god, but worships female goddesses, it's a better place for women? Well, here's India, and India is largely Hindu. It's not exclusively Hindu, but it's largely Hindu. And in Hinduism, there are many goddesses. Durga is the goddess in the upper right-hand corner, the one with the human heads around her neck and her tongue sticking out. She's very popular. Many people worship Durga. There's also Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth, Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge, etc. Here is a recent ad campaign of Hindu goddesses. This ad campaign was produced in India. with Indian artists. What do you notice about the Hindu goddesses in this ad campaign? Let's take a little closer look. What do you notice about Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge, in this image? What do you notice about this goddess or this one? India is one of the toughest countries on earth to be a woman. Yes, Hinduism includes worship of many goddesses, but that does not make India a great place to be a woman. Women are eliminated starting after the sperm meets the egg. In the poorest of villages, families will raise money so that the mother can have an ultrasound, so that it can be determined whether the fetus inside of her womb is male or female. If the fetus is female, the woman is often pressured to have an abortion. This is what's known as sex-selective abortion. India gets rid of female fetuses. It's such large numbers that it is sometimes hard for Indian men to find wives. After the female baby is born, sometimes midwives will shove uncooked rice down the baby's throat in order to choke the baby, or they will feed the baby a poisonous plant, or they will simply just not feed the baby anything, and the baby will starve to death. So, the point of this is that the pagan myth that back in the ancient past we worshipped goddesses and women were treated better is not true. And it wasn't true 10,000 years ago, and it's not true today. And in countries where goddesses are worshipped, sometimes life is very hard for women. So if the story I just told you about our ancestors in the Stone Age past living in harmony with nature, worshiping a mother goddess, and the Catholic Church coming along and murdering millions of women, if this story is not true, where did it come from? Well, believe it or not, one group of people who spread this story were the Nazis. And you have a screen cap there of a book by Hitler's Monsters by Eric Kurlander. And he talks about how the Nazis loved this idea of this ancient Germanic past where the pagan Germanic warriors were living happy Germanic pagan lives, and the Catholic Church came along and, murdered them all. Anybody who wants to criticize the Catholic Church picks up on this story. And one giveaway that they're full of BS is they'll say that the witch craze occurred during the Middle Ages, that is between the years 500 AD and 1500 AD. Why is that a giveaway? Because they're just using this story to criticize Catholicism? Because the Catholic Church was the big game in town in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, Western Europe was mostly Catholic. After the end of the Middle Ages, the Protestant religion started, and so there were other religions in town. But if somebody says to you that the witch craze was strictly from the Middle Ages, that person doesn't know what he or she is talking about. And new atheists like Steven Pinker and Michael Shermer, in their published books that have gotten great reviews, tell a false story about Friedrich Spee to prove that the Catholics were the bad people who carried out the witch craze. So basically what we're talking about here is a propaganda story. And here's another page from Eric Kurlander's Hitler's Monsters, where he talks about the Nazi obsession with witches and how the Catholic Church was out there destroying the witches, and the Catholic Church is bad. And here's just one more mention from Eric Kurlander's book Hitler's Monsters, and how the Nazis promoted the witch craze story that I just told you. So the question becomes, if the story that I just told you is false, the story about how we lived during the Stone Age, we were all happy and peaceful and in harmony with nature, and we're worshiping this mother goddess and everybody's happy and the men and the women are equal and all that stuff. Why do people tell a fake story? People tell a fake story because it makes them feel good. The story of the witch craze is a horrible story. It is a horrible story of human injustice. Tens of thousands of people were executed. Some of them were burned at the stake. Some of them were buried alive. Some of them were hung. Others were tortured. And again, the best estimate we have is 45,000 people. And not everybody who went to trial was killed. So that's maybe 90,000 people who were put on trial and who were tortured and threatened and intimidated, and their lives were destroyed. So this is a horrible story. And we want to make it not about us. We want to make it about somebody else. So if we blame it on the Catholic Church, then we don't have to feel bad. Because, if we're not Catholic, like, hey, I didn't have anything to do with that. Well, guess what? The true heartbreaking, nightmarish story of the witch craze is that people did this to people. People just like us. People decided that they were going to get their next door neighbor tortured and murdered and burned to death. And it could happen again. That's the other nightmarish, horrible thing about the witch craze. It could happen again. It could start tomorrow. Somebody makes a false allegation. Somebody else backs up a false allegation. And all of a sudden, you've got people doing bad things to each other. So let's learn the truth about the witch craze. And let's learn how we can avoid this kind of murderous hysteria in our own time and in the future. Brian P. Levac is one of the best scholars writing now about the witch craze. And in his book, which is one of the best books that you can read about this entire process, he says that the witch craze was multi-causal. Multi-causal. Many different factors contributed to these nightmarish, horrible events. These factors are psychological, something coming from the human mind; sociological, something coming from human society; theological, something coming from the Christian religion; economic, it's a pocketbook issue; and political. People within Christianity, not the entire Catholic Church, not the entire Protestant Church, but some people within the Church provided the theological foundation. What was the theological foundation? The concept of the devil and pacts with the devil. And we're going to talk more about the theological foundation. This belief alone was not enough to start a witch hunt. We know that because the witch craze was very limited by geography. You could have a witch craze going on in one town, and there could be like hundreds of people accusing other hundreds of people, and people burning at the stake like crazy. And you could go across the river or across the border or over the mountain, and you can go to the next town and people are just as religious there, and there's no witch craze. So there's some kind of local factors that are contributing to this witch craze. So let's talk about some of the factors that contributed to the witch craze. One of the big factors is something called the Reformation. The Reformation. Now, the Reformation is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. People were trying to reform, that is, improve the Catholic Church, but it had unintended consequences. So on October 31st, 1517, There's a Catholic priest, his name is Martin Luther, and he goes to the door of a church in Wittenberg, Germany, and he nails 95 theses to the door of the church. And these 95 theses are criticisms about how the Catholic Church is selling indulgences. In other words, if you want to get your sins forgiven, you have to make a financial donation to the church. And this is just totally disgusting to Martin Luther, and he wants the church to be a better church. And so he nails these theses to the church door saying, hey, we got to fix the church. And again, this is a good thing. He's a good man. He's trying to do a good thing. He's not trying to start a witch craze. The witch craze is an unintended consequence. So what happens? Christianity splits up. Remember, in Western Europe, throughout the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church is the big man on campus. It's the 800-pound gorilla. The Catholic Church is pretty much everybody in Western Europe, almost everybody in Western Europe is Catholic. After Martin Luther starts saying we got to change the church, another group splits off. They're called Protestants. And this big change had two factors that contributed to the witch craze. The first change was that people felt more vulnerable to bad magic. And the second change is that people started fighting with each other. And war, chaos, and disease and societal breakdown put people on edge. Let's talk about these two factors in greater detail. Catholicism is known as a bells and smells religion. It's a religion you can see, taste, feel, hear, and smell. Catholicism has costumes, it has special clothing, it has special incense that has a very strong scent. There are special holidays, special foods, there's even a special language, Latin. There are medals and scapulars and vestments, and these are all things that Catholics actually wear. So you're wearing something on your body that makes you feel Catholic. There's stained glass windows, there's statues, there's saints. There's all kinds of rituals where people are touching each other, like the priest puts ashes on your forehead on Ash Wednesday. The priest sprinkles you with holy water. The priest puts special oil on your body in order to bless you. There are certain times for prayer. There are certain rituals. You're standing, you're kneeling, you're sitting, you're blessing yourself. You're making a pilgrimage. So in other words, you feel Catholicism. It's something you can actually touch and smell and hear. And here's a depiction of the 7 sacraments. These are all Catholic rituals. You're wearing a special costume. There's even special architecture. You can see somebody's going to confession. There's like a special little booth that you enter where you say your confession. So that all of this stuff, people experienced all of this stuff as if it were magic. And here's the interior of a Catholic church. There's not a square inch that isn't covered with pictures and stained glass, and there's candles and there's smoke. Like the interior of a Catholic church has a special scent. You know, you could close your eyes and just sniff, and you know you're in a Catholic church. And here's a stained glass window. And these stained glass windows during the Middle Ages and the early modern period, when not too many people could read, the entire history of the Bible is depicted in these stained glass windows. Protestantism is totally different. Remember, 1517, Martin Luther, he's going to change the church. He's going to get rid of all this stuff. All you need is a Bible. You don't need the pictures. You don't need the statues. You don't need the oil. You don't need the water. You don't need the special bread. All you need is the Bible. So some Protestants, not all Protestants, some Protestants engage in a practice called iconoclasm, where they actually go through the churches and they remove the statues and they burn them and they smash the stained glass windows. because they don't need this stuff. All they need is the Bible. And here you can see some statues that have had their faces ripped off. That's iconoclasm. And here you can see actually a depiction of iconoclasm. They're taking a statue out of a church and they're going to burn it. Here's an interior of a Protestant church. Not all Protestant churches are this plain and unadorned, but in general, Protestant churches are a lot plainer than Catholic churches. So, the church didn't say that the candles were magic or that the oil was magic, but common people felt that way. Common people believed in magic. And they believed that the Catholic Church was good magic and that it was protecting them against the snares of the devil. Snare means trap. And they believe in the devil and they believe the devil's everywhere. And they felt that all that stuff helped protect them from the devil. Once they got rid of all that stuff, they started to feel nervous. They started to feel naked. They started to feel vulnerable. So that's one factor that contributed to the witch craze, getting rid of all the Catholic stuff. Another factor that contributed to the witch craze was war. The Reformation began 200 years of warfare. A king would decide he didn't want to be Catholic anymore. He wanted to be Protestant, or vice versa. He didn't want to be Protestant anymore. He wanted to be Catholic. He ordered that all of his subjects become Protestant. Maybe some of his subjects didn't want to become Protestant. There was a lot at stake. The Catholic Church owned property, buildings, funds, bank accounts. There are dynasties at stake. I'm a Catholic king. I need to marry a Catholic queen. I need to have Catholic children. Uh-oh, my queen wants to be a Protestant. Uh-oh, my kid wants to become a Protestant. There are treaties. Do you sign a treaty with a Catholic or a Protestant? There's the question of authority. Who gets to say what we do with this church building if half the people who used to be members of this church all of a sudden want to be Protestant? So people start killing each other. And there's war for 200 years. War. War. Villages are destroyed. Disease becomes rampant. People are committing horrible crimes. Have a look at this map. Commit this map to memory. This is the Protestant Reformation at its peak. The Protestant Reformation is taking place at the areas that are colored in. The areas in Europe that are not colored in are not experiencing the Protestant Reformation. That is either because they are remaining Catholic or because they are Orthodox. Orthodoxy is the kind of Christianity practiced in Eastern Europe and also in Greece. So the Protestant Reformation is not affecting all of Europe in a uniform manner. Now remember that map, because I'm going to show you another map right after this map. Okay, do you remember this map? Good, okay. Here's the map that shows where the witchcraft persecution is taking place. What do you notice? Some places are not seeing, and I'm of course looking right at Poland because I have Polish ancestry, and I'm not seeing any witch trials while the witch trials are taking place in Western Europe. Poland remains Catholic. It's a largely Catholic country. I am not saying that the Reformation was a bad thing. The Reformation was a good thing. I'm not saying that Protestants like to kill witches. No. I'm saying that the turmoil introduced by the Reformation brought with it insecurity, anger, rage, social breakdown, and persecution of alleged witches. Here's another factor that contributed to the witch craze. Weather was getting worse. The so-called Little Ice Age, after the medieval or Middle Ages, which were pretty warm. All of a sudden, the temperatures start to drop. When weather gets worse, crops fail. People starve, disease spreads, food prices rise, people are afraid, people are anxious. So this Little Ice Age contributed to the witch persecution. And here's a chart. There you have it. As the temperatures go down, the witch trials go up. As the temperatures go down, the witch trials go up. Again, same thing. Here's an article by Emily Oster. Excellent article. She relates the bad weather to the persecution of witches. Now notice what she says here. This paper explores the possibility that the witchcraft trials are a large-scale example of violence and scapegoating prompted by a deterioration in economic conditions. What does that tell you? As things get bad, people sometimes turn on their neighbor and hurt their neighbor. So this is not something that happened in the past and will never happen again. This is something, unfortunately, that happens all the time. Here's another article. Witch Trials, Discontent in Early Modern Europe by Chris Hudson. This paper examines the relationship between income and witch trials in early modern Europe. And he uses climate data because income, everyone during this period, their income is related to agriculture, related to exploitation of the earth. Once it starts getting colder, income starts going down. Now, he also says that, and the beginning of the third paragraph towards the bottom of the screen, our findings have relevance for modern day persecution. And he relates it to Africa in 2014, that when conditions get worse, people turn on each other. The lesson we should learn from the witch trials is that this is something that people do. People hurt each other when conditions are bad. And here you see the charts that he works with. He's going through several different scholars who have all shown that there's a relationship between weather and persecution. And you'll see that the two articles on the top are dealing with the early modern period, and the article by Miguel is dealing with today, 1992 to 2002 in Africa. So extreme rainfall has a strong impact on witch killings because, believe it or not, people are still killed even today for being witches or for being different in any way. If you're gay or you're an albino or you're a woman in a culture that doesn't like women, if conditions get worse, your neighbors might persecute you. And here's a chart attempting to show all the relationships that contributed to the witch trial persecution. He mentions weather, plague, and plague is related to weather. Agricultural crops and prices, also related to weather. Economic well-being, obviously related to weather. The war is related to the Reformation and religious conflict. Population demographics, because of the war, the population crashes. So many people are killed. The village is missing parents, professionals. If you had one baker in your village and the baker is killed by the war, that's a devastating loss for the village, etc. And here's another chart showing the relationship between inflation and witch trials. Here's a review of a book, Witchcraft and the Papacy. The papacy means the Pope. And this book argues that the popes were pretty skeptical. That is, that the popes, the heads of the Catholic Church, didn't really much believe in all of this witchcraft stuff. So the popes, there's many different popes, but not all of the popes were behind the witchcraft persecution. That does not mean that the Catholic Church does not deserve blame. This book is one of the most destructive books ever written. It's right up there with Mein Kampf, which was written by Adolf Hitler. Malleus Maleficarum, also known as the Hammer of Witches or the Witch's Hammer, was written by a clergyman, Heinrich Kramer, a Catholic clergyman. And this book was used again and again by people persecuting witches. This book is misogynist, it hates women, and it recommends torture, and it creates this image of women going out in the woods and having sex with the devil and committing crimes against fertility. The ideas of witches and witchcraft in this book are not biblical. The Bible is pretty quiet on what witches do. The crimes that this man, this author, Heinrich Kramer, attributes to witches come from a couple of sources. One is misogyny, hatred of women, misogyny. And the other inspiration for this book is fear of barrenness. And by barrenness, I mean a threat to fertility. And this book is powerful in its time because it preys on people's fear that magic is being used to destroy their crops and to make them hungry. And here you see a page from the book. Now, Innocent VIII, that is a pope, issued what's known as a bull. A bull is a statement coming from the pope. And he gives permission for this evil book, Malleus Maleficarum, The Witch's Hammer by Heinrich Kramer, to be published in 1484. And what the Pope says in his bull, again, it's not biblical. It's rather the voice of a society anxious about fertility. And Innocent writes, witches ruin and cause to perish the offspring of women, that is babies, the foal of animals, that is baby animals, the products of the earth, the grapes of vines, and the fruits of trees, as well as men and women, cattle and flocks, and herds and animals of every kind, vineyards and orchards, meadows, pastures, harvests, grains, and other fruits of the earth. These witches hinder men from begetting, that is giving birth, and women from conceiving, that is getting pregnant. So none of this comes from the Bible. The Bible actually says very little about what witches do. And here's a link to a My Jewish Learning article on what the Torah says about witches. And this is a society that is afraid of hunger. And one of the weirder aspects of the witch's hammer that people might want to laugh at, but if you're tempted to laugh at it, remember that people were burned to death for this alleged crime. The witch's hammer alleges that witches stole men's penises. And, that sounds ridiculous and it's laughable. Like, how could anybody be so idiotic that they would believe that witches are stealing men's penises? But think about it. Men's penises are associated with fertility, because men use their penises to get women pregnant, right? So that's to create the next generation. And also, of course, penises are symbolic of men's power. So here Heinrich Kramer says that the witches are stealing men's penises and they're keeping the penises as pets and they're feeding them oats, and the penises kind of act like pets and they play games with each other and eat oats. It's pretty bizarre. And here's a tree that's full of penises, and people aren't really sure what this tree is all about, but it may be an image of, witches stealing men's penises. And so here's a chapter of Malleus Maleficarum that talks about witches damaging penises and obvious association between witches and damage to fertility, and also women stealing men's power and stealing men's authority. And I say again here that this isn't something grounded in the Bible. I mean, there's no passages in the Bible where witches are stealing men's penises. So what about the conical hats? Why are witches shown with conical hats? Well, one reason is because conical hats were popular in the 17th century. And if you've ever seen an illustration meant to be of our first Thanksgiving, a holiday that roots back to the pilgrims who came to the U.S. to start a new life, you see the pilgrims wearing these conical hats that were popular in the 17th century. And here's an image of a woman wearing a conical hat that looks very much like a witch's hat. The name of the painting in the middle there is Portrait of Mrs. Salisbury, and it dates from 1675. And no, she's not a witch. She's just a woman wearing a conical hat, which were popular in the 17th century. How about the broom? The witch uses the broom because brooms are, of course, a sign of domesticity. The woman is supposed to spend her time cleaning the house, and she uses the broom to clean the house. And also, of course, the broom is phallic. It's like a penis symbol. And so if a woman is using a broom to gain power as a witch, it's again a woman crossing the line and stealing men's power. And this image, here's a description here of a woman which is using a broom, and this description was written in 1584. So this idea of witches being associated with brooms goes back hundreds of years. And here's a depiction on the left, which is said to be the first depiction of a witch riding on a broom. And this depiction dates from the 15th century. And ironically, it comes from a document which was meant to be a celebration of women. Okay, so we've talked about the conical hats and we've talked about the brooms. Why do we associate witches with old women? The typical victim of an accusation of witchcraft was an old, poor, isolated, unpopular woman living on the edges of society. And this again makes the witch trials all the more pathetic and nightmarish, that society devoted so much energy to murdering tens of thousands of old women. Now think of scholar Alan Dundes. In his article, Wet and Dry, the Evil Eye, Alan Dundes argues that we conceive of life as depending on liquid. When we think of life, we think of liquid, and we associate the liquid of life with breast milk, with semen. Old women can't lactate. Old women can't produce milk from their breasts. Old women are no longer menstruating. They're no longer producing blood, and old women can no longer give birth. Now think of Sir James Frazer, who told us about magic, that there's this concept of homeopathic magic. Homeopathic magic means that something that is like something else has an influence over that something else. And Frazer said that in primitive societies, people would often have sex in their fields in order to make the plants grow. An old woman is infertile. She's no longer having sex. She's bad magic. What are you going to do during a famine? You have to kill that old woman. That's not a Christian idea. That's a magic idea. So here is a description of a typical witch accusation, and this comes from a review of Keith Thomas's book on the decline of magic in Europe. This description reads, the emblematic episode, this is the emblematic episode of a witch accusation, was one in which a poor old woman, widowed and defenseless, would knock on a door to ask for food. The impatient householder would send her packing, that is, make her leave and not give her any food. And soon thereafter some misfortune would follow. A child gets sick, an animal dies, a chimney falls. The cow no longer gives milk. These people decide that that hungry old woman who asked for food was a witch. And that's why these bad things happen. And so they decide to kill her. It was no accident that Ruth Osborne, who was lynched for witchcraft by a Hertfordshire mob in 1751, had previously been refused buttermilk by the farmer who, after she asked for buttermilk and he wouldn't give her any buttermilk, he became ill. So an old woman came to his door. This old woman, Ruth Osborne, in 1751, went to his door and said, "Please, sir, I'm an old woman. I'm hungry. Please, can I just have a little cup of milk?" And he didn't give her any milk. And then he got sick. And he became convinced that she put a curse on him. That's magical thinking. That's magical thinking. And so, of course, she had to be destroyed. And they did. They killed her. This Ruth Osborne woman says she was lynched for witchcraft. And this, again, is from Keith Thomas, from his excellent book, Religion and the Decline of Magic. Keith Thomas says that the Catholic worldview, or the Christian worldview, actually contributed to the end of these beliefs eventually over time. Why? Because of that whole concept of a transcendent God who is keeping nature running the way a machinist keeps a machine running. In other words, there isn't a God in the buttermilk, and this woman doesn't have magical power. There isn't magic distributed all over the landscape. There's one God, he's in charge of everything, and he's rational, and the world is an orderly place. And Keith Thomas says that these ideas about witchcraft died out before people came to understand science, because of the Christian worldview, or what was originally actually the Jewish worldview of one God who created everything, and he's rational, and he loves you, and he's keeping everything running in a rational way. So I wrote to this guy, Brian P. Levac, the big scholar on the witch craze. He calls it witch hunt. He doesn't like the phrase witch craze. And I asked him, what ended this crazy behavior? 200 years of witch trials and fires going up in Europe. And he said it was skepticism, that they started realizing that these trials were just ridiculous and that there was no way to prove that anybody was guilty. And so they themselves, and he says this happened before science, that these people were not necessarily either scientific or atheistic. They had just gone through all this nonsense of the witch trials, and they realized that it was nonsense, and so they stopped doing it. Now, what are some good things to read to better understand all of this? It's good to read Lynn Meskel, a celebrated anthropologist and archaeologist. She writes an article called Goddesses, Jimbutas, and New Age Archaeology. And she says that when you're looking at these little figurines that are 10,000 years old or more, older than that, it's really not so easy to interpret them. There's no way of knowing if these are goddesses or what they are. Another really good person to read is Cynthia Eller and her book, The Myth of Matriarchal Prehistory, Why an Invented Past Won't Give Women a Future. She talks about that whole goddess story and how it just really doesn't make any sense. Another good thing to read is an article from Utne magazine called Debunking the Goddess Myth. The Golden Age of Female Divinities was a bad time for women. And that article by Judith S. Antonelli talks about the status of women in Judaism. A lot of people who aren't Jewish tend to criticize Judaism and say that it's a sexist religion. But you really should talk to Jewish women. They will tell you that Judaism, like the women who themselves are Jewish, they will tell you that Judaism is a good religion for women and that Jewish women do have power and authority. And we should never forget that Wonder Woman is Jewish. And another good thing to read is Lindal Ropar. She's one of the big major scholars on the witch craze, as well as Brian P. Levac. And their books are long and difficult and demanding, so if you're not going to read the whole book, a good article to read is Who Burned the Witches from Salon magazine. And it's good to know about Alonso de Salazar y Frias, and that caption there in Spanish is translated roughly into English as Alonso de Salazar y Frias stopped the harassment of witches in Spain after the trials of Zugarramurdi. This guy was a Catholic priest. Alonso de Salazar y Frias was a Catholic priest who was part of the Spanish Inquisition, and he stopped the witch trials in Spain. So yes, we need to acknowledge Heinrich Kramer, who was a Catholic priest and who wrote Malleus Maleficarum, which is a horrific, rotten, miserable book. But we also need to acknowledge Catholic priests like this man who stopped the witch trials in Spain. And this guy, who's one of my own personal heroes, Friedrich Spee, he wrote a book called Cautio Criminalis, which argued against torture. And it's one of the first books in history that says that you should not extract a confession by torturing someone. And again, this guy is a Catholic priest. He was a Jesuit priest. And he had big impact, and he stopped the witch trials in his region, and his book is still in print. And here's a statue of him and the cover of his book. And I want to close by saying that I really dislike the pagan story that I told at the beginning of this presentation, because the pagan story says there are these good people called pagans, and they were, the men and women were equal, and they loved nature, and everybody was happy. And then the big bad Catholics came along, and they ruined everything. And so it kind of creates an us and them. But in reality, there is no us and them. There is only us. And we need to take responsibility for the witch trials, whether you are Catholic or Christian or Jewish or atheist or Protestant or Hindu or Muslim. I don't care what religion you are. You are a human being. And it was human beings just like you who decided to kill their next door neighbors. It's happening every day. The Rwandan Genocide in 1994 was the fastest genocide in history, so they say. Rwandans who were member of one group, the Hutus, decided to murder the members of another group, the Tutsis. And they picked up machetes, and they went next door, and they killed their neighbors. This happens all the time. What happened during the witch trials is not finished. It's not over. It happens every day. Those same petty human emotions, the same irrationality, the same hate, the same fear. And there's a short story I think anybody who wants to understand the witch trials should read. It's called The Lottery, and it's by Shirley Jackson. And you can read the entire short story online. And the quote in the lower right-hand corner is from Zofia Naukowska, a Polish author who wrote about the Holocaust, about the Nazis murdering 6 million Jews. Ludzi ludziom zgotowali ten los. People prepared this fate for people. She's not saying German people or rich people or poor people or, no, it's people. This is how we treat each other. And I just want to say that the other day, the most powerful man in the world, this is happening in autumn 2018, the most powerful man in the world stood before an audience in Mississippi and mocked a woman who gave a credible account of being sexually assaulted. This woman is vulnerable before the world. She is receiving death threats. And the most powerful man in the world publicly mocked her. And crowds of people watching Donald Trump cheered and laughed as he mocked a woman who gave a credible account of sexual assault. I don't know if what Christine Blasey Ford said is true or not true, but I know that mocking her was a very dark thing to do. And notice that there is a small boy standing right behind Trump, learning how to mock a vulnerable person. This picture is of Lilias Adi, an alleged witch. Under torture, she confessed to sex with the devil. She died in prison in 1704 before she could be burned at the stake. Some people say that she may have killed herself. She did not give up names of other witches. That's something you were supposed to do. Like if they were torturing you, You were supposed to give your neighbor's name and say, oh yeah, my neighbor also was there and had sex with the devil. And then the people torturing you would grab other people and torture them too. But since she died in prison and was not burned at the stake, her skeleton remained, and it became like a curio. People wanted to have her skeleton because it was the skeleton of a witch. And in 2017, they took her skeleton and they reconstructed what she looked like on the basis of the skeleton. Let Lilias Adi remind us that hate and scapegoating are toxic and deadly, and it is in our power to resist them with love and with truth.